Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to join us for this continuing saga in our series of security-minded webinars. Today, well, I guess I should say who I am. I'm Alex Ormar. I'm a senior consultant with LA Networks, primarily focused on the security side of the house, but also pretty in deep with data center and wireless and storage compute solutions. But today we're going to talk about network segmentation. This is somewhat built around a response to the WannaCry outbreak that happened weeks ago. So hopefully that's still fresh in people's mind. If not, we'll review it really quickly. But to start this off, we are going to talk about some definitions. The ones in white, I think we covered in our last session. Today we're going to talk about some new concepts. So hopefully, if you don't know these, we'll go over them really quickly. So first off is what's a worm? Well, if you know what a malware is or an exploit, a worm is a self-replicating version of like a malware. Normally, if you click on something and get infected, that's the one-off thing. But in the case of a worm, the worm is going to install itself on the first host and then go searching actively for other hosts to infect. So in that case, it's self-propagating or self-replicating. Another new term, kill switch, that kind of made it into the press with the WannaCry outbreak. Kill switch is typically a feature that disables the operation of the software. In the case of a malware, it's something that causes it to go dormant or shut down. Next up is segmentation, which is the primary focus of this talk. Segmentation is a means to separate network devices or services from one another, and that'll become readily apparent as we go along. Private VLANs, that was a type. It's an older attempt at segmentation through port isolation. I don't know if not a lot of people ended up using private VLANs, still in use in some cases, but we'll touch briefly on that. Server message block, SMB protocol, also known as CIFS, that is one of the original Microsoft file sharing protocols. It was actually a combination of IBM's work on, OS 2 and Microsoft's Windows for networking efforts back in 1990. So that was version 1.0 back in 1990. We're up to version 3.11, and that's the newest as of Windows 10 and Server 2016 from Microsoft. And Netflow is our next step. Netflow is somewhat of a Cisco, it used to be a Cisco proprietary feature. It still sort of is. But it is considered a de facto standard now for networking. What it does is it collects IP network traffic statistics for later analysis. So that's pretty useful in many different ways, not just security, as we're going to be talking about it today. Next up, network admission control, or Knack, as we'll refer to it. That's a means to control access to the network based on user credentials and possibly their roles in some policy rule sets. For instance, you want to check for compliance with your antivirus updates before you allow a device on the network or something like that. And last, but definitely not least, is 802.1x, or .1x as it's colloquially called. That is an IEEE specification or standard for port-based access control that uses something called EAP over LAN to allow a network device to try and gain access to the network after it proves itself as authorized, and that's very handy for security. So now that we got those out of the way, these slides will be up posted, so hopefully if you want to refer back to these or have questions, you can grab that from our website. So what was WannaCry? So on a Friday in May, a interesting set of things started happening, and the press picked up on it very quickly because a large chunk of the UK National Health Service got infected by this malware. It ended up taking a lot of devices offline, and patients weren't able to get services and surgeries and that sort of thing. And basically, they expanded out to infect other companies in parts of the world. The Spanish Telefonica service, which does phone services across Europe and Spain, portions of FedEx and the German railway were also infected. So all in all, we kind of peg it at about less than 250,000 computers were infected. In a total about 150 countries. That's much of the world, really. The malware did its normal ransomware type of thing. If you're not familiar with ransomware, the the crux of the ransomware is to go in and cryptographically encrypt the user's files, and then provide the key only upon a ransom amount being paid to the author of the malware. So in this case, the files would be encrypted, and then a big screen popped up saying, with a countdown timer saying, your files are being held ransom, pay us some money in Bitcoin, or else we'll eventually throw away the keys and you'll lose access to your files. So that's pretty standard for ransomware. I think they asked around $600 is, I think, what it was in Bitcoin at the time. Pretty variable, but they wanted about $600. As far as we can tell, there's ways to track Bitcoin's blockchain and see whose wallets are getting the money. But as best guesses, we're saying, again, it's like less than $250 million that they netted. But probably not, because an interesting thing happened. By Monday, the entire infection pretty much crawled to a halt. Over the weekend, 250,000 computers. By Monday, it kind of died out. And that's due to a couple reasons. One is that a security researcher actually found that there was a built-in kill switch, surreptitiously found out, didn't know right away. But by registering a domain name, the malware would turn itself off if it found that name existed on the internet. Primarily, all of the security vendors like Cisco, Talos, and such were able to develop file signatures and block the spread of it within hours. I don't have the exact time when the first signature came out, but I believe it was within 2 or 3 hours. Typically, these security researchers are able to identify the file, not necessarily know why it works or how it works, but they can push out a patch or a signature to their tool saying, block this file if you see it. And that's what happened on Friday. So that said, why did this happen? Or how did this happen? So I guess the bigger question is, should this have happened? So with every catastrophe like this, it's good to diagnose what happened and do a root cause analysis to prevent it from happening again. But realistically, this is something that shouldn't have happened. The WannaCry malware used an exploit called Eternal Blue. We won't go into where that exploit came from, but it may have been a state-sponsored exploit. And it targeted the Microsoft SMB protocol that we spoke of earlier. And Microsoft actually had been made aware of this exploit a couple months earlier, prior to this WannaCry outbreak. Realistically, if you had a recent operating system and you were following a somewhat regular patch process, you should have had protection inherent just from the Microsoft security patches. Definitely within those 2 months, you should have been able to roll that out. So obviously that didn't happen, and a lot of people were caught unawares. There was a lot of, again, press attention to this, and a lot of things were spoken early on. It's like a airplane accident or something like that, where they call in people, experts in the field, and they all talk about what they think caused it or what happened. And obviously 2 weeks or a month later, the real truth starts to trickle out, and a lot of the initial assumptions were kind of false. So one of those initial assumptions was that Windows XP was a big target, and that caused the initial infection or things like that. It actually turns out that the bulk of the infections were Windows 7 and Server 2008, not Windows XP. Turns out that Windows XP actually, more often than not, would just blue screen and crash if you tried to infect it. It was very difficult to get WannaCry onto Windows XP. So to talk about, this, everybody needs to get off of Windows XP, and this was the reason this WannaCry spread so quickly, was really not quite the truth. Really, the truth was the Microsoft SMB version 1 protocol, which really nobody should be using anymore, was the main reason this exploit survived on these newer operating systems. And something I don't think we have on our slides here is that over the weekend, this last weekend, I believe Microsoft came out and said that they will actually disable Microsoft's SMB version 1 protocol going forward on new installs of their latest operating systems going forward. So in a few months, when you go to install Windows 10, for instance, SMB1 will be turned off by default. It'll still be on the operating system, but it won't be enabled. But by and large, those that were patched by Microsoft were pretty much inoculated. So all of those hosts in the UK's healthcare system were ones that couldn't be patched for any number of reasons, because they were validated to work in a certain configuration or things like that. So that's really the targets of some of these things that use exploits that are old. In this case, this is old. I think in our last session of security talks, we talked about kind of zero-day exploits and how they can slip in under the radar before those signatures are out there and before we know how these pathogens work. This is a case of one where we knew exactly how it worked, so should have been mostly avoided.
Before we move on, we have a couple questions that I'm going to ask. One was, why was there a kill switch in WannaCry?
Oh, that's a good one. So again, this is one of the things in the press, lots of people expounded upon what they thought it was. And after some more analysis, it looks to be like the kill switch was a kind of a kludgy way of trying to avoid detection in a sandbox environment. So we spoke about sandboxes before, but in case this is your first time on one of our calls, sandboxes where security researchers or a service will take the file and install it purposely on like a virtual machine, and then sit there and watch and see what this file does. Does it drop other files? Does it try and connect to command and control servers on the internet? Does it try deleting things? Does it try, in this case, encrypting files? So one of the jobs of the malware author is to try and avoid detection because you want your malware to spread quickly and without detection. So the current thought is that the kill switch was a manner by which this malware would determine he was in an isolated sandbox, because typically these sandboxes will respond to all the DNS requests with a positive response to make the malware think he's actually connected to the internet. It was kind of a newbie kind of programming thing. It wasn't very sophisticated at all, but that's what we think it was. It wasn't there for the greater good of blocking this from happening. It was really to avoid detection.
And then the other question was, do we actually need SMB or SMB version 1 for anything at this point?
Well, the short answer is no. The long answer is maybe. There are, again, if you're like the UK healthcare system, maybe you have apps that were validated to run on SMB version 1, and that's all they work with. So if you have old legacy apps, it definitely could be required for your business to continue functioning. Generally speaking, again, this is a very old protocol and has lots of problems with it. It's not very efficient. SMB2, version 2 has been out much longer and is pretty much what most programs rely on. And SMB3 is relatively newer and it doesn't have the same wide adoption. So the answer is, if you turn it off, things may break, but by and large, 99% of your stuff may be perfectly happy. Any others?
That's it for now. Thank you.
Okay. So what did WannaCry really try and do? So it's, as we say here, it's considered a worm. We spoke before, it tries to propagate on its own without any command and control. So after it installed on your host, it would start basically a network scan. It would scan to find out what other hosts it could see, and then if those hosts respond back as active, then it would look to see if that host would also be vulnerable to that eternal blue exploit. If so, then it would pop itself onto that host and then basically rinse and repeat. It would just keep doing that. So if you had a whole set of hosts that were running unpatched, pretty much WannaCry would be able to find them and install itself on them. So that's bigger of an issue if it's on your internal network. But what we found out is a lot of people still had their SMB protocol exposed to the internet, meaning they had IP addresses, public IP addresses on the internet that would allow SMB packets to go through their firewall into their internal network, either their DMZ or internal systems. And that's been a pretty horrific practice that was, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the internet really started becoming prevalent. I think it was best practices to make sure that you don't have any SMB sharing across the internet. So, of course, there are people that, again, had legacy applications that relied on it or a process that required it. We found going to customer sites pretty often, every now and then we look at firewalls and we do see SMB ports open. And when we go to talk to the customer, like, why the heck would this be open? They're like, well, we have no idea why that's there. In fact, those IP addresses it's pointing to don't exist. Those servers are decommissioned 5 or 10 years ago. So it's one of those things where it could just inadvertently be exposed because it's hard to document firewall rule sets sometimes. People don't have proper documentation or it doesn't get handed off. But with a Rapid7, which is one of these vulnerability scanning type companies, they did a scan of the open internet and found over 1 million internet devices exposed. So that could be pretty scary for something like WannaCry if it can just spread across the internet to SMB ports. You know, we're not talking about tricking a user into double clicking on a file attachment and running it. We're talking about it can just natively reach out to these devices on the internet and try and do the external blue exploit against them and then cross into the network. And again, if you had SMB version 1 turned off, you were not exposed to the eternal blue exploit. Also, if you patched, if you had recent patches, you weren't exposed. So what did we learn from this whole experience? With any ransomware attack, it's great to know that you have a good backup of your data. The whole point of the ransomware is to hold your data ransom in an encrypted format. If you have a copy of your data before it was encrypted, you know, on your backup tape or backup offsite archives, and even if you get infected by this ransomware, you could just say, the heck with it, we'll just roll back all our systems or reinstall all our systems and restore our backups. Obviously, if you're a large enough company, you may not have that kind of time. You may just want to pay some money and get that decryption key. But obviously, having good backups is important for many different circumstances, not just for ransomware, but it definitely does take the sting out of it. A lot of the people that end up paying are the ones that just realized that, in fact, they didn't have good backups, or they thought they did, and when they went to restore, they were not happily surprised. So again, we talked about patching, can't stress it enough. It's really important that you patch your operating system, but also patch the applications. So a lot of people have the Microsoft patching down pat. It's pretty simple, doesn't cost a lot to get a Microsoft WSUS server or a System Center server and have it automatically push out patches, or even just having your Windows Update service on your machines reach out to the internet and download the patches on a regular basis. That's pretty simple. The part where a lot of people do fail, though, is getting the third-party applications, your Adobe Acrobats and Flash and Javas and all the little applications that you have on your PC. They all have infinitely more patches when you add them all up together than just Microsoft. So very important to do that. In this case, WannaCry was attacking the operating system, but it could have just as easily been something attacking your version of Adobe Flash. One of the things we found was that the signature-based security products out there worked really well. So signature-based is when the security vendors are able to identify the type of file that's causing the infection, in this case, the WannaCry malware, and build a file hash that's unique to that file, and then distribute that out to all of their automatically updating services and clients. Because then the clients, when they see that hash, they can see that file being downloaded, they can compute the same hash, they can say, okay, we know what this is. Even though the name of the file may be different, we know that this is still the WannaCry. So that worked really well in this case, and many services were able to block it. One of the largest research firms out there is the Talos Group, and that's now owned by Cisco. And those guys see millions of infected files a day, which they're able to add to their corpus. And that gets distributed out to many different vendors' products, and they're able to incorporate that. And that worked great. Also, disabling legacy services. If you turned off SMB version 1 because you know that you don't need it, then you're pretty much inoculated against this. There's many other services like that. There's hardening guides especially for Windows machines. This also goes against Linux or Unix machines and devices. But there's hardening guides that tell you what you should turn off. Do you need plug and play, consumer plug and play services running on your Windows server? No, of course not. Do you need them on your desktops? Probably not. By and large, you turn off what you don't need, and then you've reduced your surface that you're exposing to these types of exploits. And the next one is on your firewalls. What we still see is a lot of firewalls that people run are just showing rules that to block things rules to allow things to go out or come in, but they always have like a default allow everything else, because every time a user comes up with a new, music sharing program or things like that, they don't want to, the security guys and the network guys don't want to have to deal with allowing this new protocol through their firewall. So in the past, there was a kind of a default allow for client traffic. Nowadays, a default deny is really the best way to do it. You want to whitelist what's allowed in and out of your network, especially things like SMB or risky protocols like that, NFS, file exports, and the like. So definitely, it's a good thing to look at your firewall rules and then make a determination as if you can go to this whitelisting type of rule set. And then really the meat of this discussion is going to be on segmenting your networks. In the terms of the WannaCry being a worm, if you had a network full of unpatched Windows machines, if one device got infected, this worm could now find its way onto other devices. If you use some network segmentation techniques, even if one device gets infected, you might be able to quarantine or isolate that infected system so it can't see anything else and it can't really go out there and touch everybody. That's kind of where we're going to spend the rest of our discussion on. Before we go into any security, though, obviously you want to know about your services and your networks. You want to know what's on them and what's of value. You don't necessarily want to spend the same amount of time protecting, all services. You may want to go through and analyze what you have and assign risks and values. So typically we can get that from existing things that you've done for your company. If you have compliance audits, like a PCI compliance or things like that, where they already say, this is your point of sale system that you need to protect, or your credit card transactions, things like that. Or if you did disaster recovery planning or something like that, where you have to do data classifications and figure out what's important in an emergency, those are probably the same things that are important to you on a normal day-to-day running operation. So with that said, once you know your data is, you may not know really what's on your network. You may think you know, but people plug things in without telling you, or stuff will pop up off your radar that hasn't been turned on in 6 months. And so even though your systems your overall like Windows patching solution may say everything's patched, there may be systems out there that it doesn't even know about. So the way you deal with that is you run regular vulnerability scans against your internal network space. That'll help you find things that aren't in your inventory. It'll find things that aren't things you normally patch. Like Internet of Things is the big thing today because there were exploits against like DVR camera systems. There's always been exploits against networked multifunction printers and things like that. So things that you may not be patching actively, vulnerability scanners can pick up and tell you if you need to go and call that vendor to come out and upgrade the firmware on your camera system, for instance. And that's pretty much it. You need to have inventories of your data and your systems and kind of know what it is you're protecting before we start going into the segmentation concept. So the purpose of the segmentation technique is really to try and break things up and compartmentalize. Kind of like a submarine where you'll have different bulkheads. So or a boat in general, if something gets punctured in the keel, that the whole boat doesn't sink. You limit the flooding to one compartment at a time. So there's many different ways we can do segmentation, and we'll go through a list of them, and we'll show some topology diagrams to try and get you up to speed on this. Some of this is more complex than others, so we'll start with simple and we'll work our way up to more complex. In this case, we're going to get up into software-defined networks and identity-based rules for segmenting users. So first off, we want to segment our clients from our servers. Hopefully you do that today, but there are people who still run flat networks. The flat networks used to be pretty simple to manage. It definitely can be very high performing because you're not having to go through switches and routers to get from your client to your server, but that's kind of outdated and the least security you can have by running a flat network. Next thing you want to do, moving up from a flat network to the client and server network, is then you want to break your servers into different groups. You may want to have any web servers or email servers that talk to the internet, be in their own little group. There's many ways to do this, so we'll look at a couple of these options. And then the highest level would be what I would call micro-segmentation, and that's where you're really breaking down all the hosts, all the workstations, and not letting them talk to each other. You kind of can control what ports and protocols and things that are allowed between them, and we'll look at some of those possibilities as well. And in the software-defined side of the world and a network-based traffic segmentation is we can use new techniques that are not widely adopted quite yet, but there's some new network-based protocols that we can use to make this even more easy to deploy without having to spend a lot of effort logging into every switch and router in your environment and add rules. So we'll get to that at the end. So here we go. Network segmentation with no segmentation. So this is, this slide is an anomaly, but this is not network segmentation. This is the exact opposite. So in a flat network like this, you may just have a firewall between the internet and your internal network, and that's your one control point. Everybody who's on the inside is on the inside, and everybody's on the outside is on the outside, and the rules on your firewall determine who gets in or out. Now here's the first real segmentation where we now break down the user traffic from the server traffic. And so in the center there, you have the one arrow between the two groups, and that would be, for instance, an access control list on a switch or router that says what the user VLANs can get to on the server VLANs. You may have multiple server VLANs, but this is our most basic breakdown. So now we have multiple control points. We could say traffic from the users can get out to the internet, but the traffic from the servers is limited to getting out to the internet, maybe just for updates or things like that. So now we have at least 3 control points. And now we're into what would be kind of the best practice for normal segmentation, which is you have demilitarized zones or DMZ segments on your firewall that for the public-facing equipment. You have your internal servers networks for servers and applications, and then you have your user subnets and VLANs for the user traffic. Obviously, people go even deeper, and they'll have networks for subnetworks or VLANs for voice devices or for printing devices and things like that. But this is what we're just showing as a basic thing. And you see there's a lot of arrows now and a lot of points of control, which is great. It also can be more complicated. In the case of the 3 arrows going to the internet, that doesn't mean you have 3 different firewalls, but it can mean that on your, for instance, one firewall, you have 3 different classes of service, 3 different groups of security, and different ACLs apply to each one. Or it could mean you have multiple firewalls. It really depends. It's kind of the creme de la creme of segmentation is where we're now going to break the users into separate groups. In fact, we may break the users into individuals. You could just have all the HR users in a group and all the research and development users in a group, and then have rules that govern what they're allowed to talk to between each other or they're not allowed to talk to each other. In this case, we're going to go all the way and say, let's have each PC, each user's machine be a separate group, and we'll assign rules to them. And we can assign rules to the group of users, so all HR users get similar rules. But 2 HR PCs, even though you're sitting in a cubicle next to each other, the 2 PCs aren't allowed to talk to each other. So that's the kind of level of segmentation that we'd like, and that would be most effective at like a WannaCry ransomware worm, where if one machine gets infected and it tries to scan the network, first off, that scan will most likely fail to most of these other segments. For instance, if an HR user gets the WannaCry virus and he's trying to scan R&D's computers, it won't be allowed, and in fact, it'll raise a lot of flags on all the security monitoring devices. That's a great thing. But now you see there's a lot of red arrows here. So there's a lot of points of control and a lot of work to do to make this happen. And there's a lot of arrows missing too. So if your HR user is trying to have a, let's say a Jabber or something, instant messaging conversation with an IT user, so there obviously is communication and maybe point to point between those 2 users, so you will have to allow those. So there'll be extra arrows that will be in there. So it's really not something you can just diagram. It becomes kind of too complicated for just like a flow chart or a diagram like this. So what you end up with is you build a policy matrix, and you want, in this case, we're showing source and destination. This is just something random. This isn't a real policy. For your company, it may be much, much more complicated. You may have all sorts of different employee groups and such. And you may have ones that are wireless based versus if you're on the network or if you're coming in from a VPN connection. So there's a lot of ways that you can start breaking up these groups. And some of these don't make any sense. Like in this example, we have executives are denied access to email. Isn't that funny? Well, does that make sense? Maybe you don't want certain executives. Maybe the CEO of your company is a big public target, and you don't want him talking to email. He has assistants that takes care of that, or he or she. So in this case, maybe that policy does make sense. But that's where we go. We got to build this matrix on paper first to see who needs to get access to what, and that's using that data classification on one hand, and then we have this new effort we have to do where we group our users. And that's what I'm going to call software-defined segmentation, because you're not doing this by hand with ACLs on a router or firewall. This is something that needs to be instrumented using an application and servers and that sort of thing. The obvious first two were the ones that you would kind of do by hand. Access control lists on your firewalls and switches, cumbersome, and it's hard to document a lot of times. Private VLANs we spoke of earlier as kind of sort of a legacy and older school type of way of doing segmentation. It's really all we had for the longest time as this was built into a lot of switches where we could do private VLANs. And that would be where you have community ports and ports that were isolated, and one could talk to the other, but maybe not to everything. And worked in some cases. It's kind of very limiting in other cases. And now we have better options. We could do things like context-aware segmentation, where we have, in this case, I'm showing Cisco Identity Services. So Cisco ICE will be able to determine who your user is. Is it an HR user? Is it an intern? Is it a temporary HR user? Something like that. And we'll be able to assign the proper rule sets to each of those users. You can have different classes of people even within a business unit. And that keeps track of it all for you using that policy matrix. Going a little bit further, Cisco TrustSec also exists, and it uses something called security group tags, SGT. And that's a process by which we're not messing with the switch ports or the firewall ports per se. What we're doing is we're tagging the traffic coming from the user. So if that HR user is flagged as an HR user, we'll assign the HR access tag to their traffic. And now wherever their network traffic goes through your network, the different devices, switches, routers, firewalls, can identify that type of traffic by the tag. That's a way for the network to really do all the heavy lifting, and you're not really going to each switch port and putting on access rules, or even with the software-defined stuff like Cisco ICE, which would put an ACL dynamically on each switch port. TrustSec kind of obliviates that and just makes it so it's more of a cohesive and holistic approach to tagging traffic. So that's something that is starting to gain more traction in the market. Not every device supported it in the past. More and more devices do support that. And then what we're showing in our level of difficulty, which is really something that requires a little bit more effort, is software-defined networking. Now, software-defined networking isn't a security thing per se. It has many, many purposes, but in the context of security, software-defined networking can bring us a lot of interesting things. So like Cisco ACI or some of these other SDNs, we can write rules that are based around our application traffic. So if a user needs to access their Salesforce or their internal HR database or something like that, the network will know what those applications are and where they live. And so as part of the SDN process, it will actually enforce the security as part of that. So that's something that's definitely on the cutting edge today, using SDN for that kind of a security. And Vmware Nsx is a similar thing on the virtualized side. You have a lot of VMs that are all running on these running on these physical hosts, and they want to talk to each other. So their traffic may not actually go through a physical switch or firewall. So how do you control that lateral traffic going between VMs? So you need something on the hypervisor in there, taking a look at the traffic on the virtual switches and enforcing your policies as well.
Quick question
Sure.
from one of the users. They wanted to know if this segmentation and security policies would work with Linux or OS X systems.
So yeah, that's a good question. Definitely with OS X, we've done micro-segmentation with Cisco ISE. Cisco ISE, typically what we use with Cisco ISE to do the segmentation is the 802.1x, which is that switch port access type protocol well, it's not switch port specific, but it's what will enforce the segmentation at the switch port. And for that to work, you need a .1x supplicant on your operating system. So Microsoft has one built in, Apple has one built in. There's third-party ones, like if you have Cisco AnyConnect, that has a agent that will do a nice job of it as well. So as far as Linux or Unix goes, I personally haven't done that. A lot of this micro-segmentation stuff we want to do on the user side, on the user access side. So not a lot of people are running Linux desktops as their desktop application, their desktop operating system. So I haven't really been exposed to that. I know there's .1x supplicants for Linux, but that isn't really the big thing for corporate America to do that just yet. So Apple definitely is picking up steam, and that is a target for a lot of these security vendors. But Windows is obviously the big elephant. The most clients deployed really that need this. I think that probably answers that. If you've gone through and done some segmentation, what is your next step? If you think you have segmentation set up, how do you know it's actually working? How do you know that that rule that prevented that intern from downloading all your HR documents is actually doing what it's supposed to do? It's hard to prove a negative, right? So you can sit there and try and run internal pen tests or vulnerability tests, from the context of that intern's profile and see what access can I get. But one of the cool things you can do is you can utilize what's already in your network, your switches and routers. They already see all the traffic flowing, and through the protocol Netflow or the Netflow service, you can gather statistics and information on those flows. So you can actually write the rules in a monitoring application like Cisco Stealthwatch, used to be called LANCO, that says if you see any intern users accessing the HR database, flag that, because in theory, my network enforcement, my policy doesn't allow that to happen. So the good thing is with any segmentation, effort, you want to have some method to validate that it's working and to catch any weird exceptions, because there'll always be, typos or misclassifications or things like that will creep into the network, and you'll just be blind to it otherwise. And a product like Stealthwatch will bring a lot of other things to the table because it does all sorts of behavioral analysis. So if you see anybody talking to the HR database at 3 in the morning and downloading a terabyte of information, obviously that's an anomaly, right? So it can raise all sorts of flags and alerts based on people doing things that isn't normal. So it can baseline your network and then kind of learn how people typically work. The next thing is that things will get in on your network. You will get hacked eventually. It doesn't matter how much firepower you have, how many devices and products you have in place. At some point, there's a very good chance something might happen. So you need to be monitoring your network perimeter, your internet edge, your firewall. You need some sort of intrusion detection, intrusion prevention devices out there. You never know when something new happens, or even when somebody internally is doing something that they shouldn't be doing. So data leakage protection is great, but also having an IDS or IPS that's watching your back and telling you that there's somebody going out and talking to command and control servers out in, Russia or China or wherever, where all these hackers are currently living. So Cisco Firepower, great thing that was from the SourceFire acquisition. SourceFire, the guys who basically invented and wrote Snort, great IDS system. So that'll something like that will sit on your network and watch people coming in and out. And there's many other features for it that you can use. And then we talked I think 3 or 4 times about doing vulnerability scans, and that's still something that if you're not doing right now, you need to do even after segmentation. You still need to be able to go in there and scan stuff. So part of the problem is once you do put in segmentation, things like vulnerability scans become harder to do. So you need to have the mechanism by which you allow your vulnerability scanner to broach these different segments and get in there and do its scans. Because otherwise, if you have a good micro-segmentation process set up, your vulnerability scanner isn't going to be able to see anything. That's what we got from that. And then third-party patching, big thing. One thing that doesn't seem to come up very often, but I'll throw it in there just to get people thinking, was the concept of unique local admin or local root passwords on machines. We all know that you may have an Active Directory that manages all your user logins, password changes, things like that. But every machine has a local, at least one local account that gives you privileged access. And a lot of companies, you may have 100 machines or 10,000 machines. They may all have the same username and password. So if one machine gets compromised and malware gets on there and is able to dump the local password database and crack that local admin password, well, now you have an account that is valid on every machine in your organization. You may have segmentation between the networks, but you may not have any segmentation in terms of security credentials in that case. So one local admin password is good for all the machines. I think security best practices would be to make sure you have a unique password for every machine. It's a bit of an operational conundrum because now your support staff needs to be able to have a manner to look up that password when something needs to be done. Some reason that they need to fix a local machine. But the side effect is that if you ever had a user who's on an airplane with a laptop or something and is calling you saying, I can't get this to work, I need to be able to log in as an admin to fix this. If you look up their unique password and give it to them, yeah, you've given them the local admin password for that machine, but you haven't compromised the integrity of security for all of your machines. So you don't have to sit there and enforce a password change on everything. So that's just something to throw out there. Definitely backups. You said what the value of having a good verifiable backup is, but definitely make sure that you have that up to stuff. Also, with ransomware and with hackers in general now, ransomware authors know that backups are pretty much the kryptonite to their whole scheme. So there has been analysis of certain malwares that are now going out and looking for the obvious places that people store their backup passwords in your backup servers. The concept is that they can go out and crash or delete or encrypt your backup servers, then you're back square one where you have to pay the ransom. So having offsite backups is paramount. You want to have something disconnected from your normal network or under different authoritative or authentication so that people can't get in, or two-factor. So at a bare minimum, have backups offsite. If I know a lot of people are using Veeam for their Windows backups. Veeam Cloud is a great plugin. You just point it to a provider and send your backup jobs offsite. You replicate them offsite. So simple things like that can be done. Last but definitely not least is do have an incident response plan. Again, you're probably going to have an incident in terms of being hacked or have malware at some point in the future. So might as well plan on it now on what you need to do when that happens. Who do you call? Who's on staff that's going to take care of the cleanup? Things like that. Definitely something that you need to have if you don't have, because it's better to prepare for it now than to have to deal with it in an emergency situation.
So I'm going to interject real quick. We have a few questions. One of them was, what is Ivanti Shavlik?
So that's one of the third-party patching solutions out there. It's changed hands a couple times now. So Avanti is the name of the company that now owns a whole bunch of stuff. Shavlik and Landesk, and I think they own Heat, which is the help desk software and things like that. So they renamed themselves to Avanti. So Shavlik does a good job of interacting or working alongside Microsoft, like WSUS and System Center and stuff like that to push out third-party patches.
Okay, and the other one was about Netflow and Stealthwatch. Mm-hmm. They wanted to know if they had not all Cisco equipment, if these Netflow and Stealthwatch would work.
Yeah,
Or mixed match.
yeah, that's a very good question. It's quite probably yes. So for instance, Netflow was a Cisco invented protocol or service, whatever we call it. Obviously, it's in wide use. It's kind of de facto standard now for network monitoring and analysis. But obviously, there are other ones. There's Juniper has JFlow. There's switch flows. There's a whole bunch of different, not somewhat competing protocols out there. And yes, the LANCOPE Stealthwatch Cisco product does support those. And there's little differences in the types of information you get from these different protocols, but they all seem to work together pretty well. Because Stealthwatch is looking for the communication source and destination on each side, and it wants to know how much data, what protocol, and things like that. So most of these other vendors support something similar.
That's it. Thanks so much.
All right. So hopefully some of this was of value. Obviously, LA Networks has a lot of experience in doing these things. If you need help, we can do simple stuff like firewall and network assessments, where we come out and look at what you have and help update your Visio maps and things like that, or come up with a report of where you could do better. Maybe do a gap analysis of current best practices versus what you have running today. We talked about like the leak thing, patch management solutions or Microsoft patch management solutions. We can help with that. Network visibility solutions, that will fall under like Stealthwatch. There's other protocols and other things we can do, SNMP, and even grabbing all the syslog data from your different devices that can help give you visibility into what's going on inside your network. So you have ideas of what's going on before users start calling you and saying something broke. Vulnerability scanning, we definitely install and resell and manage Tenable Nessus. Endpoint protection, there's plenty of different endpoints out there. They're all pretty good. In terms of antivirus, they're all pretty much the same, despite what some of these newcomer companies like Vlans and stuff are talking about. So we typically resell Trend Micro, but we work with McAfee and Symantec and all those other types. One of the best types of endpoint protection that we have today is Cisco Amp for endpoint, and that's actually pretty sophisticated and looks at all the processes and files and everything that's going on your individual computer and compares it to this cloud service that Cisco runs, and is very good at stopping things, and it's very good at helping you retroactively clean something up. So if something like a WannaCry got on your system, but nobody knew what it was, and then 4 days later, everybody knows what WannaCry is, and there's a signature out there that tells people, how not to get infected. You could use something like Amp for Endpoint to go back in time and see who ended up installing this when it was a 0-day exploit. And now you can go back and retroactively query the database and see who touched the file, when did they touch it, and now you can begin remediation of those devices. So that's pretty good, Amp for Endpoint. Backup management services, yeah, we work pretty much exclusively with Veeam today, but obviously we know all the others and still manage some of those for customers. Perimeter intrusion protection, I think that would pretty much be in terms of IDS and firewalls. We've been doing that for many years, so we can definitely help plan and implement operations for those, and even manage them for you if you don't have that time or skill set in house. So anything that's really security related, we'd be happy to talk about it. So that's why we have some of these call to actions here. So firepower threat assessment is pretty neat. We for no charge to you, we show up with a latest generation Cisco firewall with firepower, and plug it in behind your firewall and let it just see a copy of all the traffic coming in and out of your network, and it will typically alert on all of the fun stuff that your current firewall is missing. So it might be either because your firewall is kind of out of date or doesn't have the same capabilities as a Cisco product, but that's kind of neat. And I'll show you what one of those reports looks like really quickly. Also, Cisco Umbrella evaluation, pretty simple. Cisco Umbrella is a cloud-centric security service. It basically takes all your DNS requests that come out of your clients and funnels it through the Cisco OpenDNS cloud service, And so before your IDS or your firewall or your anti-malware and endpoint protections even have to kick in, at some point your user's system is doing a DNS query for that malware site. So Umbrella will see that and it'll be able to block that connection before it even gets established, because it'll just won't return the IP address to that command and control server. So Umbrella is pretty neat, and it also works on mobile devices. So when your user leaves the company and goes out to that Starbucks Wi-Fi, Umbrella is still using the same corporate rule set, and it's still reporting back to the same cloud service, so that when your users are trying to go to, or their systems are trying to go to bad places when they're not even on your network. LA Networks loves doing lunch and learns. We can pick security topics of all sorts. If we help your staff get up to speed on some of these technologies, it's great for us, because it means that now you're more conversant in the technologies, and we'd love to come out and talk about any of these. We've done ones in the past about PKI, how does certificate infrastructure work, things like just like this segmentation. There's lots of different things we can talk about. Let us know if there's some topics that you'd like your staff to get up to speed on, and we'll arrange something. And last but not least, Cisco ICE, the Identity Services Engine. We can do an online demo with you on a little webinar. We can even come to your place and show you how it works. How does Cisco ICE identify a user and either let them on the network or put them in their own little quarantine group if they don't play nice with the rest of your network. So Cisco ICE is a fairly complicated product, which is why we don't typically offer just a free evaluation, because it takes a lot of effort to integrate into your environment, like that policy matrix that we shown earlier. That's the type of thing that you have to do up front to figure out how you're going to do these policies. And so it's easier for us to just show you an existing network that's set up right, and give you the chance to look at it and figure out if this makes sense for you. So that's what we do. Feel free. Oh, here's a picture of the Firepower Threat Assessment. You get back these reports that show things like, how many devices are doing silly stuff, how many people are watching videos all day long, that kind of thing. And then Umbrella, similar thing with reporting. I get to see all the domains. In this case, we're seeing how many malware and command and control requests and things that have gone through. So yeah, and in our last seminar, we went over all of these other products. So if there's stuff that you want to know about, Splunk or ThreatGrid or any of these things, you can pull up the recorded webinar from our website. That's pretty much it. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we hit our stop time right on point. So I thank you very much, and feel free to give us a call if you have any questions or need some help with this, with your security. Thank you much.
Thank you.